The desert planet of Korath had 2 suns and 0 mercy. During the day, the ground cracked like old skin and the air shimmered so hard that distant rocks looked like they were floating. During the night, the temperature dropped fast and the wind came in sharp and cold, cutting through anything that was not properly sealed. Most people who landed on Korath did so by accident or by necessity. Very few stayed by choice. Adam was one of the few. He had arrived on Korath 11 years ago with a second-hand toolkit, a small amount of saved money and no particular plan. He had set up a repair station at the edge of the Badlands, a wide stretch of cracked red earth that stretched out for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The station was not pretty. It was a collection of connected metal buildings, patched and repatched over the years, with a small landing pad out front and a covered workshop that smelled permanently of engine oil and burnt wiring. But it worked. And so did Adam. He was not the kind of man who talked much. He was tall, lean, with rough hands that were always a little dirty no matter how many times he washed them. He had short brown hair going gray at the sides and calm eyes that missed very little. The travelers who stopped at his station often came in frustrated, tired, and worried about their ships. They left with working engines and a quiet sense that everything was going to be fine. Adam had a way of making broken things feel fixable. It was the one thing he was genuinely good at. His days followed a steady rhythm. He woke early, checked his scanner for incoming traffic, worked through whatever repairs were waiting, ate alone, and went to bed when the second sun dropped below the horizon. He did not mind the quiet. He had lived inside it long enough that it felt comfortable, like an old coat. On the evening everything changed. Adam had just finished repairing a cracked fuel coupling on a small cargo hauler. The owner had already left, pleased and in a hurry. Adam was cleaning his tools, moving slowly with the radio playing low in the background and the last light of the day going orange across the flat desert outside his workshop window. His scanner beeped. It was not a loud sound. Just a single soft tone that meant something had entered the atmosphere nearby. Adam glanced at the screen without much urgency. Ships came in rough sometimes, caught by Korath's unpredictable wind currents on approach. It was not unusual. But then the signal changed. The steady incoming line on the scanner broke apart. The ship's speed dropped too fast. The trajectory went wrong. And then, 6 kilometers to the east, the signal became a crash marker. Adam stood still for a moment looking at the screen. He pressed the emergency broadcast twice, sending a standard distress relay to the regional authority channel. Then he waited exactly 40 seconds for any kind of response. None came. The authority station was hours away and understaffed. He had learned long ago not to count on them for anything fast. He grabbed his medical kit from the shelf, the one he had been slowly adding to for years. Bandages, fluid packs, a small diagnostic tool, basic pain medication suitable for several species, a thermal blanket, a handheld light. He packed it into his rover without rushing but without wasting time either. He pulled on his dust coat, sealed his goggles and drove east into the darkening desert. The rover moved well on the cracked ground. Adam had built it himself from salvaged parts, and it handled the rough terrain smoothly. The headlights cut through the rising dust and the temperature was already dropping, the cold coming in from the open flats the way it always did after sunset. He found the ship after about 15 minutes. It had come down hard. One of the stabilizer wings was completely gone, probably lost in the upper atmosphere. The hull had split along the left side on impact, and one section of the engine was still burning low, sending a thin column of black smoke up into the dark sky. The landing gear had not deployed. The nose of the ship was partially buried in the earth. Adam parked the rover at a safe distance and walked toward the wreck carefully, checking for fuel leaks and secondary fires before getting close. The burning section was at the rear and seemed to be dying down on its own. The main hull was not at risk of explosion as far as he could tell. He moved closer. The front section of the ship was damaged but intact. The cockpit was empty. The pilot's harness was torn, which meant either the pilot had been thrown or had escaped before impact. Adam moved through the wreck slowly, checking each section, stepping over broken panels and loose wiring. He found no adults. The ship was quiet except for the sound of cooling metal and the low moan of the desert wind moving through the split hull. Adam swept his light across the interior, checking every corner. His beam caught the rear cargo hold door, a reinforced panel set into the back wall of the main cabin. It was sealed from the inside. He knocked twice. Not loud. Just a steady, calm knock. Silence. He knocked again and then said, in a level voice, that he was not there to hurt anyone and that whoever was inside should not be afraid. A long pause. Then a small sound from behind the panel. Not words. Just a sound, tight and careful like something listening. Adam sat down on the floor of the broken ship, directly in front of the sealed panel, and turned his handheld light so it faced upward and lit the ceiling softly instead of pointing forward. He did not pull at the door. He did not call out again. He simply sat with his hands open on his knees and waited. It took several minutes. Then the panel slid open slowly. 3 small faces looked out at him from the darkness. They were alien children. Young, no older than human children of perhaps 6, 8, and 10 years by the look of them, though Adam knew alien ages were difficult to judge. They had pale, faintly scaled skin and large eyes that caught the soft light and reflected it back in a way that made them look almost luminous. Along their arms and the sides of their necks, thin silver markings glowed very faintly, like something lit from underneath the skin. They were pressed together, the eldest one in front with the smaller 2 tucked behind her. They stared at Adam. Adam looked back at them quietly. He could see that they were frightened. He could also see that the youngest had a cut above its eye that had dried but needed cleaning. The middle child was shaking, possibly from cold or shock or both. The eldest was the most still, watching Adam with sharp, careful eyes that reminded him of someone trying to decide whether a situation was safe. He did not move toward them. He reached slowly into his medical kit, took out a thermal blanket and set it on the floor between himself and the open panel. Then he sat back again, hands open, and waited. The eldest child looked at the blanket. Then at Adam. Then at the blanket again. After a moment she reached out and took it. Adam exhaled slowly. He began to pack the medical kit back together in unhurried movements, making no sudden gestures, keeping his body language as calm and unthreatening as he could. He spoke occasionally, not saying anything important, just letting them hear his voice and understand that it was steady. He told them the cold would get worse in the next hour and that he had a warm station not far away. He told them there was food and water and that he would not ask them anything tonight. He told them they did not have to trust him yet. They just had to come with him and they could decide about the rest later. The eldest child translated something quietly to the younger 2 in a language Adam did not understand. The middle child said something back. The youngest just watched Adam with enormous eyes and then nodded, once, the way small children do when they are still afraid but have decided to be brave anyway. Adam stood slowly. He held out his hand. The eldest child looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. He carried the youngest, who was too unsteady to walk well, across the broken hull. The eldest helped the middle child. They moved through the wrecked ship together and out into the cold desert night. Before he got into the rover, Adam turned his light back toward the ship one final time. He swept it across the hull near the nose, where the exterior markings were. Most of them were burned or scraped away by the impact. But one section, sheltered slightly by a bent panel, was still visible. It was a seal. Formal, detailed, unlike anything on a civilian vessel. Adam did not recognize it. He took a photo with his wrist device and looked at it for 2 seconds, then put it away. The children were already in the rover, pressed together under the thermal blanket. Adam got in, started the engine, and drove home through the dark. Adam's station had 3 rooms beyond the workshop. A small kitchen, a supply room, and a rest area with 2 narrow cots that he used when he was working long nights and did not want to walk to his sleeping quarters at the back of the building. It was not much. The walls were bare metal, the floors were worn, and the lighting was the kind of flat white that made everything look a little tired. But it was warm. And right now, warm was the most important thing in the world. He set the youngest child down on one of the cots and spread the thermal blanket across all 3 of them as they huddled together. They did not resist. The cold had gotten into them during the short time outside and they were all shaking now, the youngest most of all. Adam turned the heater up 2 settings and moved to the kitchen without a word. He did not know what alien children of their species could eat safely. This was the first problem. He stood in front of his small food supply and thought carefully. He had basic provisions, mostly things with simple ingredients. Plain grain cakes, dried fruit, canned broth, water, and a few pouches of a neutral nutrient paste he kept for travelers who came in sick or exhausted and needed something easy on the stomach. The paste was designed for multi-species use, which made it a reasonable starting point. He warmed a small amount of the broth first, just enough to raise the temperature slightly, and poured it into 3 separate cups. He carried them to the rest area on a flat piece of metal that served as a makeshift tray and set it down on the floor in front of the cot. Then he stepped back and leaned against the far wall, giving them space. The eldest child looked at the cups for a long moment. Then she leaned forward carefully, picked one up and smelled it. She held it under her nose for several seconds with her eyes half closed, processing the scent in a focused way that told Adam she was checking it rather than enjoying it. Then she passed 1 cup to the middle child and kept 1 for herself. She left the 3rd where it was. The youngest had fallen asleep already, leaning against the eldest's shoulder with its small mouth slightly open. Adam watched the two awake children drink slowly and carefully. When the middle child finished and looked up at him with uncertain eyes, Adam picked up the third cup and set it closer to the youngest without waking them. Then he sat down cross-legged on the floor at their level and simply stayed there. He was not trying to communicate. He was not trying to do anything except be present in a way that did not feel threatening. He had learned a long time ago that with frightened creatures, whether human or otherwise, the most powerful thing you could offer was simply the absence of pressure. After a while the middle child made a small sound and leaned over to say something quietly to the eldest. The eldest responded in that same low, unfamiliar language. It was soft and had a particular rhythm to it, rising slightly at the end of each phrase. Adam listened without pretending he understood. Then he got up, went back to the workshop and began going through what he had salvaged from the wreck. He had brought back a bag of items from the ship. Mostly small things he had grabbed quickly while getting the children out. A sealed emergency pouch, 2 personal carry cases, a portable power cell, and a translation device that had seen better days. It was cracked across the face and the main speaker was clearly broken, but the core unit looked like it might still function if he could get power to it properly. Adam spent an hour carefully opening the device, cleaning the contacts, replacing a burned connector with a compatible part from his own supplies, and testing the power draw. At around midnight it came on with a weak flicker. The screen was damaged and half the display was gone, but the audio function worked at low volume. He brought it back to the rest area. The eldest child was still awake. The other 2 were sleeping now, pressed together under the blanket. She watched Adam cross the room and sit down again on the floor. He held the translation device out toward her, not offering it exactly, just showing it to her. Letting her see what it was. She recognized it immediately. Something changed in her expression, a small shift that was not quite relief but was close to it. She reached out and took it from him carefully, turned it over in her hands, examined the repair work he had done. Then she looked at him directly for the first time without the guarded, sideways quality her gaze had carried all evening. She pressed the device's activation point and spoke a short phrase into it. The device translated in a flat, slightly broken voice. It said, "You fixed it." Adam nodded. She looked at the device then back at him. She spoke again. "Why did you come to the ship?" Adam thought about the answer for a moment. Then he said simply that his scanner picked up the crash and there was no one else close enough to help in time. She listened to the translation carefully. Then she said something else. "You did not know who was inside." Adam said that was correct. He had not known. It did not matter. If a ship goes down and you are close enough to help, you go. The eldest child was quiet for a while after that. She sat with the translation device in her hands and looked at the sleeping faces of the younger 2. Then she looked around the room slowly, taking in the worn walls, the flat lighting, the basic and unimpressive surroundings of a working repair station on a desert planet. Adam watched her process it all without rushing her. He got up, went to the kitchen and came back with a small plate of grain cakes and dried fruit. He set it between them on the floor. He took 1 grain cake himself and ate it unhurriedly to show her it was safe. She watched him do this. Then she picked up a piece of dried fruit and ate it slowly. They sat together in a quiet that was no longer entirely uncomfortable. Over the next 2 days, a careful and gradual process took place inside the station. Adam learned their rhythms. The youngest, a small and round-faced child who seemed to recover from shock faster than the others, became comfortable first. By the second morning the youngest was following Adam around the workshop at a cautious distance, watching him work with enormous curious eyes. Adam narrated what he was doing in a low voice as he worked, not expecting to be understood, just filling the air with calm sound. The middle child was quieter and more careful. This one watched everything before doing anything, eating only after seeing the others eat, moving only after seeing the path was clear. Adam respected this and never tried to hurry it. He simply made sure that whatever he offered was always predictable, always consistent, always gentle. The eldest child, who Adam had privately been calling Sira in his head since the first night, was the most complicated. She was clearly intelligent in a way that went beyond just her age. She asked questions through the translation device that were precise and observational. She asked what the tools in the workshop were for. She asked how the station's heating system worked. She asked once very directly whether Adam lived here alone. He said yes. She considered this. Then she said, "You are not afraid of being alone." Adam thought about that for a moment. Then he said that he had been alone long enough that it had stopped feeling like something to be afraid of. It just felt like quiet. Sira translated this to the others. The middle child said something that made the youngest laugh. a short bright sound that bounced off the metal walls and surprised everyone including itself. Adam felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. On the second evening he changed the dressing on the youngest child's forehead cut. He warmed the cloth first, worked slowly and talked softly the entire time. The youngest sat still and watched his face with the focused concentration of a small creature deciding whether to fully trust something. When Adam finished and pressed a clean seal strip over the cut, the youngest reached out and patted his hand once, firmly, and then went back to eating. Adam stared at his hand for a second. Then he went back to work. That night he filed another distress report through the authority channel. He kept it vague, mentioning only that survivors from a crash had been recovered and were in his care pending contact. He hit send and watched the signal go out. He did not yet know that it was being blocked. He did not yet know what was coming. He only knew that the station felt different now with 3 small lives inside it. Less quiet. Less empty. Different in a way that he did not have a word for yet, but that did not feel bad. He turned the corridor light on before going to sleep, so the dark would not feel too heavy for anyone who woke in the night. Then he lay down and stared at the ceiling for a long time before his eyes finally closed. The data chip was in bad shape. Adam had found it on his second trip back to the wreck, tucked inside a sealed compartment behind the pilot's seat. The compartment itself had protected it from the worst of the impact damage, but the chip had still taken heat exposure from the nearby fire and one corner was completely melted away. Most people would have looked at it and thrown it in the scrap pile. Adam set it on his workbench and looked at it for a long time. He had rebuilt worse. Not much worse but worse. The key with damaged data chips was not to rush. Heat damage was unpredictable. Sometimes the data was gone completely. Sometimes it was sitting there perfectly intact, just locked behind a broken access layer that needed careful work to get through. You could not know until you tried. And the only way to try properly was slowly. He started that evening after the children had settled for the night. He worked under a magnifying lamp, using the finest tools in his kit. He cleaned the contacts first, removing the carbon buildup from the heat exposure with a soft brush and a careful hand. Then he tested each data layer individually, starting from the outermost and working inward, checking which sections were responsive and which were dead. The melted corner had taken out roughly a third of the chip's total storage. The remaining 2/3 were damaged but present. He built a small bypass bridge using wire thinner than a human hair, connecting the functioning sections around the dead ones. It took most of the night. His eyes ached from the close work and his back was stiff from sitting hunched over the bench, but he kept going with the steady patience of someone who had learned long ago that most problems responded to time and attention if you gave them enough of both. Just before the first sun came up over the desert, the chip connected. Adam plugged it into his reader and leaned back in his chair, rolling his neck slowly while the reader processed. He was expecting ship registration data, maybe some personal files, possibly a travel log. Standard contents for a vessel data chip. The reader finished processing. Adam leaned forward and looked at the screen. He read through the first document slowly. Then he stopped and read it again from the beginning, more carefully this time, making sure he was understanding what the words were actually saying. The 3 children were not ordinary passengers. They were the hidden heirs of Prince Valen Soren, a senior royal figure within the Solari Empire. The Solari were not a civilization Adam knew much about in detail, but he knew the name. Everyone in this region of space knew the name. They were powerful, organized, and old. Their territory covered a significant portion of the surrounding systems and their political decisions had consequences that rippled outward for hundreds of light years. According to the documents on the chip, there had been a coup attempt inside the Solari royal court. Someone close to the throne, the documents did not name who, had moved against Prince Valen. The attempt had not fully succeeded, but it had come close enough that the prince's most trusted people had made an emergency decision. The children, all 3 of them carrying royal bloodline status, were too vulnerable in the capital. They had been placed aboard a small, unmarked transport vessel with a team of trusted guardians and sent out of Solari space quietly, meant to reach a safe location where they could be hidden until the political situation stabilized. The accident was not an accident. The documents included partial flight data showing that the ship's navigation system had been remotely interfered with during approach to Korath. Someone had sent a false guidance signal that pushed the ship off course and into the Badlands at a speed the landing systems could not compensate for. The Guardians had managed to seal the children in the rear hold before impact. That was the last entry. Adam sat very still in his chair and looked at the screen for a long time. Outside the workshop window, the desert was turning pale gold as the first sun began its climb. The station was quiet. He could hear the faint sound of the youngest child shifting in sleep from down the corridor. He reached out and closed the reader's screen. Then he sat back and pressed his hands flat against the workbench and thought. A mechanic with no military background, no political connections, and no particular standing in the galaxy had 3 royal alien children sleeping in his rest area. The people who had arranged the ship's crash believed the children were dead. At some point, probably soon, they would send someone to confirm. Adam stood up. He went to the station's outer doors and checked every lock. Then he went to the supply room and began pulling out the additional seal bolts he kept for storm reinforcement and fitting them to the door frames, quietly and methodically, one by one. He was on the 3rd door when his scanner beeped from the workshop. He walked back and looked at the screen. 2 ships had appeared on the edge of his range, coming in from the north. They were broadcasting a search and rescue identification signal, the kind that emergency response vessels used. Adam looked at their flight pattern for a moment without moving. They were flying wrong. Search and rescue ships spread out when they were looking for a crash. They moved in wide arcs, scanning broadly, adjusting course frequently as they picked up new data. These 2 ships were moving in a tight, parallel line. Steady speed. Consistent altitude. They were not scanning the area. They were moving toward a specific point, methodically, the way you moved when you already had a general idea of where you were going and you were approaching carefully. Adam watched them for another minute. Then he went back to fitting the seal bolts. He did not change his expression. He did not move faster than necessary. He simply worked through the problem the way he worked through every problem, one step at a time, without panic, without wasted motion. By mid-morning, Sarah found him at the workbench. She had the translation device with her, as she did most of the time now. She set it on the bench between them and stood looking at him with those sharp, careful eyes that never seemed to miss much. She asked what he was doing. Adam said he was running maintenance checks. Tightening things up. Sarah looked at the seal bolts lined up on the bench. She looked at the reinforced door frame visible from where she was standing. Then she looked back at Adam with an expression that said very clearly she was not a child who accepted incomplete answers. Adam set down his tool. He looked at her for a moment, deciding. Then he turned the reader screen on and showed her what he had found. He watched her face as she read. She was still, the way she was always still, but something shifted underneath the surface of her expression. A tightening around the eyes. A change in her breathing, slow and controlled, the kind of control that came from training rather than from calm. She read through to the end without speaking. When she finished, she stood with her eyes on the screen for a while longer. Then she looked up at Adam and asked, through the translation device, one quiet and direct question. She asked if he was going to give them to the ships outside in exchange for a reward. Adam had been tightening a connector on the workbench when she asked. He did not stop what he was doing right away. He finished the turn of the tool, set it down carefully, and then looked up at her. He said no. Not with any drama. Not with a long explanation or a speech about doing the right thing. Just the single word, said plainly, in the same tone he used when telling a customer that a part was not going to hold and needed to be replaced properly. Sarah looked at him for a long moment after that. The translation device was quiet. She did not ask why. She did not ask what he was going to do instead. She just stood there looking at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be unreadable and was not entirely succeeding. Then she picked up the translation device and walked back down the corridor toward the rest area. Adam heard her speak quietly to the other 2. He did not know what she said. He picked up his tool and went back to work. On the scanner screen behind him, the 2 ships were closer now. Still moving in that same tight, steady line. Still flying like hunters who had not yet spotted what they were hunting but knew roughly where to look. Adam did not watch them. He knew they were there. He kept his hands moving, kept his breathing even, and began thinking carefully about everything in the station that could be useful and everything outside it that he knew better than anyone else alive. The desert had been his home for 11 years. If something was coming, it was coming into his ground. And Adam intended to be ready. The ships landed 2 kilometers from the station just before dark. Adam watched them come down on his scanner screen. They did not land on the marked pad. They landed in the open flats to the west, away from the station's sensor range, or at least away from where a standard sensor range would reach. Adam had extended his own sensors 3 years ago using salvaged parts from a crash survey drone. He had done it because desert storms sometimes came in faster than the official weather alerts, and he liked to know things early. Right now he was very glad he had done it. He counted 4 life signs leaving the ships. They were moving on foot toward the station, spread in a loose line, not rushing. Professionals did not rush. They moved at a pace that was steady and quiet and covered the ground without announcing themselves. Adam had seen enough rough operators pass through Korath over the years to recognize the pattern. He turned off the workshop's main lights. He went to the rest area and crouched down beside the cots where the 3 children were sitting awake. Syrah had already sensed that something had shifted in the station's atmosphere. She was sitting up straight with the translation device in her hand and the younger 2 pressed close on either side of her. Adam kept his voice low and his tone even. He told them that some people were coming toward the station and that they were not friendly. He told them they were going to move now, quietly and quickly, and that he needed them to follow his instructions exactly and without hesitation. Syrah translated for the younger 2 immediately. No delay, no questions. Adam noted this and felt a small measure of the tight feeling in his chest ease slightly. Good. They could move fast when they needed to. He led them to the back of the supply room and moved a heavy shelving unit to the side. Behind it was a floor panel, a meter square, sealed with 2 hand bolts. Adam opened it in under 10 seconds. Below was darkness and a metal ladder leading down. He had built the tunnel network 6 years ago during a particularly brutal storm season when 3 separate surface structures had been damaged by wind shear. He had decided then that having underground access between his main buildings was worth the months of work it took. The tunnels ran beneath the station in a rough cross shape, connecting the workshop, the main building, the generator housing, and the outer equipment shed about 40 meters from the main structure. They were low and narrow, just wide enough for a grown person to move through at a crouch, and they smelled of dry earth and old metal. Adam went down first with a small handheld light. The children followed. Syrah came last and pulled the floor panel shut above her. They moved through the tunnel in a single line, Adam in front, the youngest child directly behind him with one hand holding the back of Adam's coat. He moved slowly enough that they could keep up but fast enough to cover ground. The tunnel was cool and very quiet. Above them, through the earth and metal, nothing could be heard yet. Adam brought them to the junction point beneath the workshop and stopped. He had prepared 3 things before moving the children. The first was a set of thermal emitters, small devices he had built from heating elements and salvaged signal components. He had placed 4 of them at different points across the station's surface before going dark, each one programmed to emit a heat signature roughly equivalent to a moving person. They would not fool a highly sophisticated scanner for long, but they would create confusion, and that was all he needed them to do. The second thing was a frequency jammer he had built into the station's outer wall 3 years ago, originally designed to block the cheap tracking signals that some less honest traders tried to attach to his equipment. It was running now, broadcasting a low-interference field across the immediate area. The third thing was his toolkit, which was currently strapped across his back in a canvas roll. He knelt in the tunnel junction and opened the roll across the earth floor, working by the small light. He pulled out his frequency scanner, a handheld unit he used for diagnosing electrical faults, and switched it to passive detection mode. It picked up the external signals from the approaching agents almost immediately. He studied the frequency patterns for a moment. Then Syrah, crouching beside him in the narrow tunnel with her knees pulled up and the translation device held carefully in both hands, spoke quietly. She said that Solari scanner technology had a specific gap in its detection range. A weak frequency band that their systems historically did not cover well because of a design decision made generations ago that had never been corrected. Her guardian had mentioned it once during a lesson she was not supposed to be present for. She had been sitting behind a doorway listening, the way she listened to most things. She gave him the frequency number. Adam looked at her in the low light for a moment. Then he looked back at his equipment. He found the frequency band on his scanner and checked it against the signals coming from outside. She was right. There was a clear gap. The agent's scanning signals had a blind spot, a range of frequencies they were simply not reading. It was not large, but it was enough. Adam pulled 2 of the thermal emitter control units from his toolkit and began adjusting their output frequencies by hand, shifting them into the band the Solari scanners could not read clearly. In that band, the emitters would appear as strong false signals rather than background noise, drawing the scanners toward them. Meanwhile, anything operating in that same frequency range would be effectively invisible. He worked in the dark tunnel by touch as much as by sight, his fingers moving across the small components with the ease of long practice. He did not have to think about the movements. His hands knew the work. His mind stayed focused on the problem. It took 11 minutes. When he was done, he activated the adjusted emitters remotely and watched his own scanner for the result. The false signals bloomed clearly in the frequency gap, for strong heat signatures moving in a pattern across the station's surface above them. To the agent scanners, it would look like 4 people moving through the upper station buildings. Adam rolled his toolkit back up and strapped it across his back. He looked at Syrah. She was watching the scanner screen over his shoulder with focused attention, reading the signal pattern with the same sharp, analytical expression she brought to everything. The younger two were behind her, quiet and still. The youngest had both hands wrapped around Syrah's arm and was pressed against her side, but was not making a sound. Adam moved them further through the tunnel toward the outer equipment shed. Above them, he could occasionally feel the faint vibration of footsteps moving across the station floor. The agents had entered the main building. He tracked their movement through the vibrations and through the distant, muffled sounds that reached them through the earth. They were methodical, checking each room, moving in pairs. They would find the station empty. The false signals outside would pull their attention back to the surface. They would sweep the area, find nothing, and have to reassess. This would not last forever. Eventually the agents would realize the signals were decoys. Eventually they would start thinking about underground spaces and structural anomalies. Adam had maybe a few hours before the tunnel stopped being safe. But a few hours was what he needed. He brought the children to the equipment shed access point and stopped again. The shed was outside the main station perimeter. From there, the open desert stretched east toward the deep badlands where even experienced trackers rarely went because the terrain was too broken and too unpredictable. Adam knew every meter of it. He looked back at the three children in the narrow tunnel. The youngest was pale but steady. The middle child had not made a single sound the entire time and was watching Adam with an expression of complete concentrated trust that sat heavily on him in a way he did not show. Syrah met his eyes and gave him a small nod, precise and deliberate, the kind of nod that said she understood the situation and was ready. Adam thought about 4 trained agents moving through his station above him. He thought about 2 ships sitting in the western flats with their engines cooling. He thought about the data chip and what it contained and the size of the political machinery that was moving against 3 small children who had done nothing except be born into a dangerous family in a dangerous time. He was a mechanic. He fixed broken things. Right now, the most broken thing in his world was the situation these children were in. He turned back toward the shed access, lifted the panel quietly and checked the surface above. Clear. The cold night air came down into the tunnel and the stars over Korath burned hard and white in the black sky. Adam climbed up first, checked again, and then reached down to help the children up one by one. They moved out into the desert dark together, silent and low, away from the lights of the station and into the broken ground where Adam had spent 11 years learning every shadow and stone. Behind them, inside the station, 4 agents found nothing but empty rooms and cooling air. They stayed in the Badlands for the rest of the night. Adam knew a place about 2 kilometers east of the station, a shallow depression in the rock where 3 large stone formations had fallen against each other years ago and created a natural shelter. The space underneath was low and cramped, but it blocked the wind and kept a person invisible from above. Adam had sheltered there twice during storms when he had been caught too far from the station on foot. He knew exactly how to find it in the dark. He brought the children there without hesitation, moving across the broken ground in a low crouch, keeping the station lights behind them and using the rock formations as cover. The youngest was tired and stumbling by the time they arrived but made no complaint. Adam lifted the child over the last rocky section and set them down gently inside the shelter. The middle child crawled in after. Syrah came last, watching behind them before ducking under the stone. They sat together in the cramped dark space and waited. Adam kept his scanner on low power mode, watching the agent signals move around the station. They searched for 2 hours. Then the signals pulled back, moved to the western flats and stayed near their ships. They were reassessing. Possibly calling for instructions. Possibly waiting for daylight to make a wider search. Adam sat with his back against the cold rock and thought. He could keep moving. Take the children deeper into the Badlands and stay hidden for days, maybe longer. He knew the terrain well enough to avoid a search team. But the agents would eventually bring more people. More ships. Better equipment. The desert was large, but it was not infinite and hiding was not a solution. It was only a delay. He needed to reach someone on the outside. Someone within the Solari structure who was loyal to Prince Valen and had not been turned by the coup. The data chip had mentioned a name in one of the corrupted files, a partial name with a military title attached. Adam had not been able to recover the full record, but the title was clear. Commander. Solari Military. He did not have a full name, but he had a signal code, a specific frequency identifier that the loyal forces were supposed to use for secure contact. The problem was getting a signal out. The agents were running a jamming field across the area. His own portable equipment was not powerful enough to punch through it. The station's communication array was powerful enough, but it was inside a building currently being watched by 4 armed people. Adam looked at his toolkit in the dark and thought carefully about what he had and what he could do with it. By the time the first sun was beginning to lighten the horizon from black to deep blue, he had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan, but it was the only one that made sense with what he had available. He told the children to stay in the shelter and not move until he came back. He told Sarah specifically that if he was not back within 2 hours she should take the younger two and move further east into the deep rock country and stay hidden. He told her there was a supply cache under a flat red stone about 3 kilometers in, marked with a scratch pattern he described to her carefully. Sarah listened to all of this through the translation device without interrupting. When he finished she looked at him and asked if he was going back to the station. Adam said yes. She did not tell him to be careful. She looked at him for a moment with those sharp eyes and then nodded once, the same precise nod she had given him in the tunnel. It meant she understood and she trusted his judgment even when she did not like it. Adam moved back across the dark ground toward the station alone. He came in from the east side, using the equipment shed access he had used to leave. The shed was clear. He moved inside and crouched in the dark, checking his scanner. 2 agent signals were inside the main building. 2 were outside near the landing pad watching the approaches. The ships were still in the western flats. He needed the communication array in the workshop. It was in the main building. So were 2 armed agents. He also needed more power than the array currently had. The jamming field was strong and punching through it would require stripping power from other systems and feeding it directly into the array's output. He knew how to do this. He had boosted the array once before for a long-range contact during a particularly bad storm season. The process involved working directly with the power feed cables behind the array housing, which meant close contact with live plasma conduits. He worked in the equipment shed first, pulling components he needed from his stored salvage. A power bridge, 2 heavy cables, a manual frequency lock he had built from spare parts 2 years ago. He packed them into his toolkit quietly and then moved to the workshop entrance. He went in low and fast, staying below the level of the workbench. The 2 agents inside the main building were in the rest area and the kitchen, based on his scanner. The workshop connected to the main building through a single internal door that was currently closed. He had a few minutes at least. He went straight to the communication array and began working. He pulled the housing panel and got behind it, connecting the power bridge cables to the main feed. The work was fast and practiced, but the space behind the array was tight and the cables were stiff and heavy. He had to pull hard to get the second cable into position, wedging himself into the corner with the array housing pressing against his shoulder. He was locking the second cable connector when the plasma conduit beside it shifted. It was a small movement. A stress crack in the conduit wall that had probably been there for a while, weakened by the power rerouting he was doing. The crack opened under the increased load and a jet of plasma discharge hit his left hand before he could pull it back. The pain was immediate and severe. Adam pressed his hand flat against his leg and held it there and did not make a sound. He breathed through his nose, slow and controlled, and waited for the first wave of pain to pass enough that he could think clearly. When it did, he looked at his hand in the low light. 2 fingers on his left hand were badly burned. The third and fourth. They were not going to work properly for a long time, possibly ever. He wrapped his hand tightly in a strip of cloth from his coat pocket, pulling the binding firm with his teeth and his working hand, and went back to the array. He finished the connection one-handed. It took longer. He did not stop. When the power bridge was complete, he activated the array and began tuning the frequency lock to the signal code from the data chip. The boosted output was significantly stronger than normal. He could see on the readout that it was pushing against the jamming field and cutting through it in a narrow band, like a needle going through heavy fabric. He sent the contact signal. The Solari code from the chip, repeated on a tight beam, carrying the location data of the station and a short compressed message containing the children's names and status. Then the internal door opened. One of the agents stepped into the workshop. Adam was already moving. He dropped behind the workbench as the agent raised a weapon, and the shot hit the wall above him and left a black scorch mark across the metal. Adam moved along the back of the bench toward the far end, staying low, using the heavy workbench and the equipment racks as cover. The workshop was full of large machinery and stored parts, and every meter of it was territory Adam knew with his eyes closed. The agent did not know it at all. Adam led him through the workshop in the dark, moving quietly between machines, letting the agent follow sounds and shadows. When the second agent came through the door, Adam was already on the far side of the room near the tunnel access. He kept them moving, kept them off balance, never staying in one place long enough to be cornered. He was buying time. He did not know how much he needed. He only knew the signal had gone out and now he had to stay alive long enough for it to matter. The agents were getting closer. They were learning the space. Adam's options were narrowing and his hand was slowing him down, and he knew it, Then Sierra stepped out from the tunnel access behind the lead agent. She had not stayed in the shelter. Of course she had not. She moved with a precision that had nothing childlike about it, placing herself exactly, both hands coming up in a controlled and deliberate motion. She struck the lead agent at a specific point on the side of the neck with 2 fingers, a short sharp movement, and the agent dropped to the floor completely without a sound. The second agent spun toward her. The outer wall exploded inward. Commander Nara Voss came through the breach with 6 Solari soldiers behind her, moving fast and clean, and it was over in seconds. Adam leaned against the workbench in the sudden silence and looked at Sierra across the room. She was breathing hard. Her composure was slightly cracked for the first time since he had found her in the wreck. She looked back at him and something in her expression was both frightened and fiercely proud at the same time. Adam nodded at her once. She lifted her chin and nodded back. The workshop was quiet after the soldiers secured the 2 agents. Nara Voss moved through the station with the efficiency of someone who had spent a long career making fast assessments in difficult situations. She was tall for a Solari with the same pale scaled skin and silver markings as the children, but deeper in color and more defined, the way those markings apparently darkened with age. Her uniform was dark and without decoration except for a single rank insignia on the collar. She had sharp eyes and a composed face that had clearly learned long ago not to show everything it was thinking. She checked the children first. She went to each one personally, crouching to their level, speaking to them quietly in their own language. The youngest grabbed her arm and held on. The middle child leaned against her shoulder with the careful exhaustion of someone who had been holding themselves together for days and could finally stop. Sierra stood straight and answered Nara's questions in a controlled voice that only wavered once, very briefly, before she steadied it again. Adam watched this from across the room. He was sitting on the edge of the workbench with his wrapped hand resting on his knee. One of Nara's soldiers had brought a medical kit from their ship and was waiting nearby. Adam had not let anyone touch the hand yet. He was not entirely sure why. He supposed he had simply not stopped moving long enough to sit still and let it be dealt with. He sat still now. The soldier worked on his hand with quiet competence. The 2 burned fingers were cleaned, treated with a medical compound that reduced the immediate damage and wrapped properly. The soldier told him in careful basic common language that the fingers would need surgical work. The tendons were affected. Without proper treatment he would lose most of the movement in both fingers permanently. Adam looked at his wrapped hand for a moment. Then he nodded and said he understood. When Nara finished with the children she crossed the workshop and stood in front of Adam. She looked at him the way she had looked at the station when she came in, taking a full accounting before saying anything. Then she said that she owed him a debt that was difficult to put into words. She said that the 3 children he had kept alive were the only remaining heirs of Prince Valen Soren. The coup had moved further and faster than anyone had anticipated. The prince was alive but politically isolated, stripped of most of his support. The children were not simply family. They were the legal foundation of his claim to continue leading his house. Without them, the coup would have succeeded completely within months. Adam listened to this without changing his expression. Nara told him that the Solari Empire wished to offer him formal recognition. Wealth, enough to live well for the rest of his life without working another day. A title of honored friend of the royal house, which carried legal protections and privileges across all Solari territory. A place at the court if he wanted it, a permanent residence, a position of respect. She listed these things clearly and waited for his response. Adam was quiet for a moment. He looked around the workshop, at the scorched wall where the agent's shot had hit, at the pulled-apart communication array, at the damaged conduit that had taken his fingers. He looked at the workbench where he had spent more hours than he could count working through problems one careful step at a time. Then he told Nara what he wanted. He wanted enough to cover the full repair and rebuild of the station. The outer wall that her soldiers had come through would need to be replaced completely. The communication array needed new components. There was damage to the supply room and the eastern tunnel access and the equipment shed. He had a list of parts and approximate costs already forming in his head as he spoke. He wanted that covered. He also wanted the cost of the hand surgery covered. Full surgical repair, the best available because he used his hands for work and he needed them to work properly. That was all. Nara looked at him steadily for a moment after he finished. Then she said that what he was asking for was a very small amount compared to what was being offered. Adam said he was aware of that. He said he did not need what he had not asked for. He had a station that suited him and work that suited him and that was enough. He was not being modest and he was not performing humility for anyone. He simply meant it. Nara studied him for another long moment. Then something shifted very slightly in her composed expression. Not quite a smile but something adjacent to it, a kind of recognition, the look of someone who had just understood something they had not expected to encounter. She said that the offer would remain open if he ever changed his mind. Then she turned to begin organizing the departure. The next 2 hours were full of movement and logistics. Nara's soldiers processed the captured agents, secured the ships in the western flats, and began preparing for departure. Medical staff from Nara's vessel came to the station and properly examined all 3 children. The youngest had to be carried to the ship and went without complaint, almost asleep on the soldier's shoulder. The middle child stopped at the station door on the way out and turned back to look at Adam across the room. They looked at each other for a moment. Then the middle child pressed both hands flat together in front of their chest and bowed their head, a small and formal gesture. Adam did not know what it meant exactly, but he brought his own hand up in a quiet acknowledgement, and the middle child turned and went out the door. Zira was last. She did not move toward the door when the others did. She stood near the workbench where Adam was sitting and waited until the others had gone, and it was only the 2 of them in the workshop. The translation device was still in her hands. She had carried it every day since Adam repaired it. He wondered if she would take it with her or leave it behind. She looked around the workshop the way Nara had looked at it, but differently. Not assessing. Remembering. Her eyes moved across the tools on the wall, the scanner screen, the patched metal surfaces, the flat white light that made everything look a little tired but also very real. Then she looked at Adam and began to speak through the device. She told him that among the Solari, when someone protects a royal heir through genuine personal risk, they are offered a bonded title. Not a political title, not a formal rank. Something older than those things. A name that connects the person to the royal line and stays with them permanently, recognized across all Solari territory for as long as the line continues. She said it had never been given to a human before. She said she was giving it to him anyway. She spoke the title in her own language first. It was a short word, 2 syllables that sounded like something moving through still water. Then she gave him the translation. It meant, as closely as it could be carried from one language to another, one who stayed. Adam sat with that for a moment. The workshop was very quiet. Outside, he could hear the distant sound of Nara's ship powering up. The desert wind was moving across the station the way it always did in the early morning, low and steady and older than anything humans or Solari had ever built. He thought about 11 years on Korath. About the quiet he had built around himself and the work he had filled it with. About a scanner beeping on an ordinary evening, and a wrecked ship in the dark flats, and 3 small frightened faces looking out from behind a sealed panel. He thought about how he had not hesitated. Not once. He looked at Sira and told her in a plain and quiet voice to grow up strong. She held herself very still for a moment. Then she nodded, the same precise nod she had given him in the tunnel, the one that meant she understood completely and would not forget. She set the translation device down on the workbench beside him. She turned and walked out of the station without looking back, the way people who are serious about things tend to leave them, cleanly and without prolonging what is already complete. Adam listened to the ship lift off. He did not go outside to watch it go. He sat in the quiet workshop for a while. Then he stood up, picked up his toolkit with his good hand, and looked at the hole in the eastern wall where Nara's soldiers had come through. It was a big repair job. He would need to order specific materials. He began making the list in his head, working through it methodically, one item at a time. Months passed. The station was rebuilt. Better than before in some places, the same as before in others. Adam's hand came back to about 90% function after 2 rounds of surgery. Close enough. He adapted the rest. Nobody officially explained why the Solari commercial shipping route through the Korath sector had been quietly adjusted. The new route passed within clear scanner range of a small repair station on the edge of the Badlands. Supply packages arrived occasionally with no sender information. Good quality components, useful materials, things a working mechanic could always use. Adam never contacted anyone about it. He never mentioned it to the infrequent travelers who stopped at his station. He accepted the packages, put the components to work, and said nothing. But he kept the station lights on through the night now. All of them. Burning steady and bright in the dark desert, visible for a very long distance in every direction. Visible if someone knew where to look, from orbit. He had no family. No particular place in the wider galaxy. No title he used or rank he claimed. He was a mechanic on a desert planet who fixed broken things for a living. But somewhere out among the stars, 3 children were growing up who knew his name. And somewhere in the records of an ancient royal house, in a language he could not read, in a tradition that had existed for longer than his civilization had been watching the sky, his name was written down next to a title that had never belonged to a human before. One who stayed. Adam turned off the workshop light, walked to the doorway and looked out at the desert night. The stars over Korath burned hard and countless and very far away. He stood there for a while just looking. Then he went inside and went to sleep, the way a man does when he has done what needed doing and the day is finished and tomorrow there will simply be more work. Which was, for Adam, exactly enough.